the bloody moon are you trying to pull, he snarls. You're putting yourself and your child in danger, and for what? For the sake of every other elf in the human kingdoms, perhaps, she answers, her voice chilly. He's going to start a civil war, run on. It's this or everything we've ever worked for will be for nothing. I can't agree to this. It's not your decision to make. Rayla glowers at him, her patience wearing thin. We have to end this, and we have to do it now. I'm not letting my daughter grow up in a world with that bastard in it. Ranan has nothing to say to that. General Amaya, Commander Gren, and a small team of troops arrive at the tail end of Rayla's 32nd week. She doesn't look at all pleased about this plan either, but she glances between her and Callum, her eyes hard, and doesn't argue. It's a relief, thinks Rayla. She's tired of explaining the logic, and the more she has to do so, the less logic she sees in it herself. All Amaya does sign is I hope you know what you're doing, which does little to alleviate the growing anxiety in Rayla's stomach because, when it comes down to it, she doesn't. There's every chance Balan is already in the capital sowing more dissent and more unrest until there's a mob threatening to break down Ezran's door. There's every chance he'll do it anyway, even if they reactivate his rune. There's even a chance that he won't come at all, and he'll wait until after the baby's born, and attack then. Failure is a very real option here, and literally the only thing that makes Rayla want to stick with it is the thought of her daughter growing up while Balan's still alive. So they let Amaya set up a guard at the entrance to the Nexus. They ask Luyan to double her illusions along the mountain. Callum, Soren, Claudia, and Ranan agree to guard Rayla personally in turns, and when everything is settled on, Rayla swallows and hands Claudia the broken sheath. Do it, she says. Let him come. Notes. Almost there, team. Chapter 22. Summary. All there is left to do is wait. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Xyi. It's a trap, obviously. Really, drawls Balan. I never would have guessed. He snorts into his tankard and drinks deeply from it, the ale bitter in his throat. This tavern is becoming an old haunt. It's empty tonight. The common folk who frequent it have all gone home and the barman had retired hours ago, afraid to ask him to leave, and too tired to wait for him to. For now, it's him, his books and his maps spread out over the table, and the castle guard, come to warn him that Ezran's men have doubled their efforts to find him. It's been 2 weeks since his return. There's been no trace of the prince and his slut of a wife. The castle gates are shut, and even the scullery maids who work there are tight-lipped and quiet. No one's seen Callum and his elven princess. No one's heard from them. No one knows where they are. Unsurprising, Balan had thought at first. Halfling babies come early, and if he's done his math correctly, the elf will go into labor within the month. Callum's first and only priority after the attack at the Bantha Lodge would have been to find somewhere safe, somewhere he can't follow and strike her down when she's at her most vulnerable. He'd done well, Balan supposes. It's admirable, really, the lengths he'd go to for his wife and that abomination of a child she's carrying, but they should know better than to think they can hide when he has uninhibited access to their city and its people. But this is clever, even for them. He's been frowning at his map for hours now. He'd studied it for days after they disappeared across the Sanagan, tracing lines and routes with his fingers and trying to track them down himself. When he found nothing, he'd readied a move to draw them out, one they'd hear of wherever they might be hiding that would destroy them to ignore. But now the little blip is back, a tiny spot of color on the yellowing parchment of his map of Katolis, bright and eager for his attention. At first, Balan had blinked at it, certain that he'd just been staring for too long. Perhaps his mind had finally caught up with his age and he was going senile at last, but it's there and it's Raoul, beckoning to him like light in a tunnel. Had the Midge girl's magic failed? Did they know that he was privy to their location once more? Could they really have made it that easy? He'd wanted to laugh when the thought crossed his mind. Of course they had. Of course they knew, they'd probably planned it to the letter. This is a taunt. A dare. An unspoken come-and-get-me designed to bait him into attacking while the prince, that Midge girl, and that ex-soldier boy are all waiting for him. An interesting move, but a poorly thought-out one all the same. He taps the colored dot on the map with the bottom of his tankard. I'm heading off in the morning, he tells the guard mildly, like it's an errand, like a hunting trip for something he's been tracking for months. From a certain standpoint, it is. Will you be coming this time, or will you be hiding in the castle again? The guard scowls at him. Considering everyone you've paid for this blasted mission of yours is dead, hiding in the castle feels like the smarter choice. So no, then. So this is foolish, then snaps the guard. You've seen what the prince can do. You know what he's capable of. Your magic won't stand a chance against an archmage as powerful as him. Cowardice is unbecoming. So is dying. The guard shuffles uneasily, the creak of the floorboards beneath his feet loud in the empty silence of the tavern. He takes a breath. You need to stop this. They won't forgive you for what you've done already. They will hang you for treason if Prince Callum doesn't get to you first. I don't believe this is worth your life, General. Balin snorts at him. What's worth what is my decision to make, he says crisply. Then I want no part of it. A pity. Balin's tone is dry as he swills the remaining ale around in his tankard and sets it on the table. However will I manage? The guard skulls. I'm trying to help you, he hisses. His Majesty's forces will stop at nothing to track you down, and if they don't find you, Prince Callum will once his wife has had the baby. There's no hiding from them now. Neolandia might give you refuge, but you have to stop this now. I'll stop when that whore is dead, snarls Balin. He's on his feet all of a sudden, his tankard thudding heavily against the floorboards when he knocks it off the table in his anger. The reaction surprises even him, his fury like ice in his veins, and when the guard shrinks back, grey eyes wide with fear, Balin finds his frustration entirely renewed. Pathetic, he snaps. You're nothing but a coward. Get out. But, General, the guard falters. I am loyal to you. I'm trying to keep you alive. Get out. He jabs a finger at the door, irritated and impatient and angry for reasons even he doesn't really understand. Perhaps it's the guard's call, his defiance of him under the guise of wanting to help, or maybe he's just tired of playing the long game. Either way, he no longer has the patience to deal with this, and he stares the guard down until his shoulders slump, and until he turns on his heel and leaves without another word. Balin waits until the tavern door shuts behind him before he reaches into his pack for a candle and clay pot of ash. He lights it deftly, a pinch of the ash already in his fingers, and not for the first time, he finds himself marveling at the ingenuity of dark magic. Ares, Wodas Fatide, he mutters, sprinkling the pinch into the flame. He feels the power flow out of him with his breath, draining his lungs and his energy, his vision blurring just a little as a wolf materializes on the tavern floor. Its hulking shoulders are still and unbreathing as it waits for his instruction, its eyes glowing purple and eerie in the poor light. Balin takes in a breath, lets it fill his lungs once more, his fingers against his temples to massage the ache away as his vision clears. Find him, he tells the wolf. Kill him. He'll be more useful in death. X. Almost a year and a half ago, Balin was dismissed from the Catolan Council at a hearing. He'd been humiliated, beforehand, in front of an audience of elven and human dignitaries, imprisoned in the castle dungeons for a week like a common criminal, and when he was summoned to Ezran's throne room at the end of it all, he'd been given only a moment to justify his actions before he was stripped him of his command and his titles, and Ezran ordered him to leave. There was no trial. No appeal. No justice in his Majesty's actions, and he'd left the castle disgraced and furious with nowhere to go but to his empty house on the outskirts of town. In His Majesty's employ, Balin had spent almost all of his time in his quarters at the castle. There was never any reason to go home, and even now, he despises the cold and the emptiness of it. It holds too many memories, houses too many thoughts of the son he'd lost at the hands of elves at the breach, and of the wife who'd died shortly afterwards in her grief. He'd been a poor husband and father, he'll admit that much, he was never home, even then, and at times, his ambition felt more important. He'd come from nothing, and he was a low general at the time. He wanted more than this. He wanted more for them. It made sense to him then, to send Lynette to Amaya when he turned 16. It was an appropriate career choice for the son of a general, even a lowly one, more appropriate than Lynette's dream to be a baker, certainly, and any success he had would reflect well on their family. Alis had begged him not to do it. Lynette was needed at home. He would be happier at home. Neither of them cared less about where their family stood, as long as they were home, and together. Their indolence irked him. How could someone not want more? How could someone be so satisfied with so little? They were wrong. They were weak. And Balin sent Lynette to the breach anyway, against his wife's wishes, against his son's wishes, and when Lynette fell, there was no one for Alis to blame but him. It wasn't his fault, he'd reasoned to himself. He hadn't put that sword through Lynette's back. He hadn't given the order to raid that outpost. He'd sent hundreds of men to the breach, and most of them came back. How could he be responsible for the death of his son? How could wanting more for his family be the reason Lynette was gone forever? No, the only ones to blame here were the elves who slaughtered him. They'd committed the act. They'd murdered his son, and no number of men he sent to the breach, no number of elves they felt would bring Lynette back. He threw himself into his work then, unable to deal with Alis' grief, unable to bear her resentment of him, and when she died, he hardly felt remorse. She'd hated him towards the end. The very few times he went home, he was greeted with cold glares and pent-up rage, and on top of it, he was angry too. Lynette's death wasn't his fault, and he only wanted what was best for them. It was unfair and uncalled for to blame him for it, but that wasn't how Alis saw it, and that wasn't how she saw him. He wasn't welcome at her funeral. Her family blamed him for it all too. He sunk into himself. He could feel himself becoming more and more bitter by the year, his resentment of elves growing with every visit to that wretched house. Then the war ended. Prince Callum brought home that whore. They were to address her as Lady Rayla, or her ladyship, like she deserved the title. Like she was worth more than even a moment of their time. Like her people weren't the same cold-blooded monsters who murdered Lynette and countless others. 3 years into this supposed peace, the rumors started. Callum was to marry her, an elf with no noble background or social standing, in a show of unity. They would have to start addressing her as princess. Any halfling children she might produce would have claims to the Catolan throne, and Ezran had plans to open their borders to Xadia, allowing the uninhibited travel of elves into the human kingdoms. There'd be monsters, murderers, in their very city, and Ezran and Callum welcomed it. He'd been weak then, when his only thought had been to rid the city of her. The other kingdoms would never have accepted it. Catullus would be ridiculed and mocked for a young king's naivety. But then Ezran dismissed him, stripped him of his hard-earned title, and the status and authority that came with it, and in defense of that slut to boot. To say he was angry was an understatement. His title and position, gone. His family, gone. Anything and everything he ever cared about, gone, because of elves. And every day there's more of them, and his own people are growing to accept their presence in his city. The idea disgusted him. It disgusts him still. The one thing that Ezran hadn't stripped from him was his pension, and it was under the condition that he was never seen in the castle again. Balin's grateful for that, he supposes. It means he can spend most of his day outside of that house, and it means he can hole up in this tavern every day until he has no choice but to go home and bear the ghosts of his long-dead wife and son. This plan of his had hatched here, in this very booth. He'd been drinking then. He usually was. The haze of alcohol had made it easier to deal with, well, everything, and when he thinks about it now, he doesn't actually know exactly when he'd decided to take the idea seriously. He was drunk. It was stupid. He had nothing to his name but that house and enough money from his pension to get by on a week-by-week basis, and it seemed impossible, but he still despised that whore and everything she stood for, and more than anything that day, he wished she was dead. She and Callum were still only engaged then. It was all the city could talk about for a while, and every word of it made him shudder with disgust. Using magic to get what he wanted hadn't even occurred to him. Until he was wandering the black market days later and found a book. It was old. The pages were torn and yellowing, the leather binding so worn that the symbol on the front was almost entirely gone, but he'd seen it before, on Lord Byron's things, and on other books that Midge Girl used to carry around with her. Interested, the storekeeper asked, following his eyes. I found it in Neolandia. It's not so looked down upon there. Still illegal, but you'd only be fined for it. Here, it's risky to even own a book of dark magic. Balan had frowned, running his hand over the leather and across the tattered edges of the pages within it. What can you do with it? The storekeeper had smirked at him. Whatever you want. It's easy enough to learn. All you need is the right ingredients. More curious than anything else, Balan had shrugged and bought it without thinking too much about it. He'd leafed through it that night in the tavern, more sober than he had been in months. He'd found tracking spells in it, and shield spells, and incantations for strength, elemental spells, and remedial spells, even rituals to conjure the ashes of the dead into living weapons to do his bidding. He'd started small. Lights in his home. Warmth in the winter months. A cold breeze in the summer. The power it filled him with was unlike anything he'd ever felt before, and it occurred to him, far too late, that perhaps this was the sort of power he should have been chasing all those years ago. Status felt like small change compared to this. Raw, unbridled magic was something else entirely, and it could bring him more wealth and more power than even being the head of the Katolan army could ever afford. It was taxing, yes, but the exhilaration was addictive. The idle thought became less of a joke, and more of a genuine what if. What if their elven princess was suddenly murdered in her bed? What if it came on the heels of civil unrest? What if a civil war broke out? Would Ezran keep the gates to the kingdom open then? When the prince and his whore returned for their wedding, the concept of what if became realer in his head. Then they saw a midwife. Balan had almost laughed when the news came to him. What if X. He rides for the village of Era in the morning. It takes him 2 or 3 days on horseback at most, and it's very much a small town. It's halfway up a mountain, its townspeople rural and not so educated, and the village itself is closer to the breach than most, but they don't look twice at him, even with his saddlebag of magical ingredients. The top of the mountain is, apparently, named the Cursed Caldera because of the terrifying creatures that wander its slopes, but, quietly, Balan wonders if there's something else to it. His map is pretty determined in its claim that the elf is up there, and he's learned to stop doubting his magical ability now that he can see what he can do. It's so easy. He's been experimenting with dark magic now for only a few months, and the progress he's made is astounding. He sends shadow ravens up the mountain for reconnaissance, watches through their beady purple eyes and finds himself delighted to see the elf in such a delicate condition. She waddles gracelessly when she moves, her steps awkward and lumbering as she tries to do certain things herself. Her companions dote on her, and while he despises Callum almost as much, he treats her with the love and care he should have given Alis and Lynette all those years ago. But it's not his fault they're dead, he reminds himself. The elves killed Lynette. Alis had died of grief. It's not his fault. He focuses his attention on the elf. All there is left to do is wait. X. He's here, Claudia says one day. Rayla's halfway into her 33rd week now, and spends her days pacing to ease the churning in her stomach and to breathe as her contractions begin to grow more regular. She stops in her tracks and swallows, eyeing Claudia uncertainly as she stares up at the sky with a crease over her brow. How do you know? Don't look, says Claudia, but there have been shadow ravens flying past for a couple of days now. He's watching. Waiting, I think, until he knows you've gone into labor. She grimaces, her lips pulling downwards with fear. Rayla, I really don't think this is a good idea. In perfect honesty, neither do I, Rayla admits. But this is all we've got left. This baby's not going to grow up afraid of him. We have to end this now. I know, says Claudia. I'm just scared. Rayla lets out a mirthless snort. So am I. Notes. I hear you guys wanted to see Balan be an actual human being, so here's his backstory, I guess. It didn't feel right to not resolve his past issues, and the story wanted it, so story gets what story wants. BC, I'm not in control here. In any case, a bunch of people on Discord wanted it, y'all know who you are, so if this came out a bit dumb, I'm blaming them, ha ha ha. Sorry for the delay. Really not understanding how you people live working 9 to 5 every day. I can't believe how much I miss the night shift. Chapter 23. Summary. Don't even start, she grumbles. I know he's coming just as well as all of you do, but pretending he's not by avoiding the subject altogether isn't helping. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 23. Rayla's 33rd week finds her pacing around the Nexus, restless and agitated and muttering to herself about how she's sick of being huge and uncomfortable. It's pretty understandable, she can't move any faster than a brisk waddle, and for someone so used to being so much more active, Callum can see why she's so annoyed. The Balin thing isn't exactly helpful either, because that's what she's doing. Essentially, she's waiting for him to appear, knowing that he will at the worst moment imaginable, knowing that she'll be helpless when he does, and probably hating her plan a little bit more every day. It can't be good for her or the baby, but Callum is hesitant to approach her anyway. She knows what's at stake. She knows it all better than he does. She doesn't need him to tell her to calm down. She's just hormonal, Soren says, waving him off dismissively, but Callum scowls at him. She's pregnant, he says sharply. She has every reason to be and more. Whoa, hold on, I didn't mean it like that, I just... Guys. That's Claudia, and she holds her hands up between them, her lips twitching upwards in an exasperated smile. It's totally understandable. We get it. What do you want us to do? Callum breathes out a sigh. Just, I dunno, distract her, I guess. From all of this. She shouldn't have to be any more stressed about this than she already is. It's probably not good for her. It's not, pipes Rowena with a grimace. She shouldn't be on her feet so much either, but short of asking her to spend the next 3 or so weeks in bed, which she won't, there's not a lot we can do. Well, what can we do, then, asks Soren. He crosses his arms in front of his chest, his impatience clear on his face. We obviously can't let her keep mulling this over, but she's not exactly making it easy for the rest of us to keep her safe and healthy. I don't envy you at all. He smirks at Callum. Callum only rolls his eyes. Just, help her think about other things. Keep her mind off Balin. I'll mention it to Aunt Amaya and Rhiannon too, but Balin is our job, remember. All she should have to worry about right now is herself and the baby. We can do that for her, at the very least. Right. Keep her mind off Balin, says Claudia, nodding. We can do that. How hard could it be? 5. They've had a talk about her and Rayla knows it. She's not stupid. They are worried about her, which she gets, and they think her plan is stupid, which it is, and in all fairness, their concern isn't unwarranted, but it's not helping either. She's been through a lot over the last few months. Her baby is due in 2 to 3 weeks. There's a madman out there who wants her dead and, so far, has stopped at nothing to do it. She has enough on her mind without them fretting over her, and maybe Callum's noticed that she's bothered by it, or maybe it's his way of trying to deal with his own stress and feelings, but they've had a talk about her and it becomes abundantly clear that they have when General Amaya, of all people, sits her down that afternoon without Callum to ask if she can feel the baby. Am I not allowed to dote over my soon-to-be grandniece or nephew? She signs when Rayla blinks at her, obviously surprised by the request. You're allowed, signs Rayla, recovering quickly. I just didn't expect it from you, I guess. I can understand why. Amaya chuckles at her. I'm not really the maternal type, am I? I certainly never intended to have them myself, but I don't dislike children. Callum made sure of that when he came into the world. He is a... Rayla pauses, unsure of the sign. She spells it in the end. He's a SWEETHEART. Amaya's lips twitch, and she signs the word for her, a fond sort of amusement in her eyes. I didn't think I'd ever have a halfling grandniece or nephew, she comments mildly. Rayla snorts. We considered naming it after you, you know, she signs. Oh. A bemused sort of flattery crosses Amaya's face. Callum's idea, signs Rayla. I think it was supposed to be a joke at first, but it was after he spent weeks coming up with stupid names and it was the first one neither of us hated. We're not going with it after all, if that's all right with you. I had a better one anyway. A better one than Amaya. Signs Amaya, smirking. Rayla stifles a chuckle, but her fingers tremble anyway as she spells her little moonbeam's name. Sorry, Amaya's smirk falls. She blinks. For a moment, she stares, her lips parted like she doesn't quite believe it, but Rayla offers her a nervous sort of smile and signs it again, her hands steadier and more deliberate this time, so that Amaya knows there's no mistake. Sorry, she tells her. Is that okay? When Amaya's lips twitch again, they tilt upwards into a smile. A real one that crinkles the corners of her eyes as signs her response. It's perfect. Better than mine, for sure. I'm glad, chuckles Rayla. She holds her hands out for Amaya's, her fingers gentle against hers as she places them against the bump. The baby shifts under her touch, and Amaya's smile grows wider still, a spark of excitement in the hazel of her eyes. I know what this is, signs Rayla after a moment. I know Callum spoke to everyone. He did, Amaya tells her, pulling back just enough to sign her response. He wants you to relax. We all do. Rayla raises an eyebrow at her, a smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. You as well, General. Amaya snorts. She pulls back once more, but her grin stays fixed. Rayla thinks, for a moment, that she might sign something witty, or sarcastic, but there's honesty in the way her hands move. Aunt, she corrects. When she spots the flash of confusion on Rayla's face, her smile becomes, almost nervous, and too late, Rayla realizes that it's because this is uncharted territory for them. As much as she knows that General Amaya doesn't disapprove of her relationship with Callum anymore, there's always been a sort of distance between them. Mostly it's Rayla, afraid to overstep or to assume there's more than a tentative friendship there. She's Aunt Amaya to Callum and Ezran, but always General Amaya to her, even now, after 4 years of peace and 6 months of marriage to her nephew. But Amaya's smile is genuine, and she signs the word again as if to insist. Aunt, she repeats. I'm sorry I've taken so long to adjust to you, but you're family now. Sorry I would have liked you from the beginning. She'd want no formalities between you and her. It's only fair I do the same. Understanding dawns on her. She'd known what it meant to Callum when she suggested it. She'd known what it meant to Ezran when she'd told him. She can't believe she hadn't realized how much it would mean to Amaya. Sorry I's a good name, then. Rayla signs at last. Yes, signs Amaya. Aunt Amaya. It is. 4. Your baby's gonna be a nerd. One would think that, after 2 months of putting up with Soren's poor humor at the Bantha Lodge, Rayla might have grown used to the dumb things that find their way out of his mouth, but every now and then, he says something so outlandish that it always takes her a second to catch up. My baby's going to be a what now? A nerd, drawls Soren. He tosses a moonberry into the air and tries to catch it with his mouth, only to miss and have it bounce off his nose instead. It's his turn to be her personal guard today. The idea makes her scowl. She shouldn't need a personal guard, and the fact that she does only reminds her that she's on the cusp of 34 weeks pregnant and that there's a madman trying to kill her, which is the exact opposite of what she should be thinking about if she ever intends to relax the way Callum and the others want her to. She rolls her eyes at him, bristling. What makes you say that? She grumbles, trying to be patient. Soren snorts at her and tosses another moonberry into the air. Have you even met your husband? If he's gonna have a hand in raising this kid at all, she's going to grow up to be a nerd. What you need is to make sure she hangs out with someone cool to make up for it. Surely you don't mean yourself. Rayla smirks at him, making no attempt to hide the snicker that escapes from her lips when he misses the moonberry. Course I mean me, I'm the coolest person up here. He flashes her a grin. Rayla thinks it's meant to be suave, but it comes off closer to idiotic, especially while his teeth are stained pink with moonberry juice. Who else is gonna teach her how to spar? Rayla raises an eyebrow at him. Me. Who's gonna teach her how to ride? Probably. Archery. Run on. Battle tactics. Aunt Amaya. Soren huffs, frustration growing behind the faint pout on his features. Then he clicks his fingers and grins. I can teach her how to pick up boys. What if she's into girls? I've picked up girls too. I know what girls like. He beams at her, proud and stupid and smarmy, but Rayla only smirks wider. No offense, but Callum's actually married, she teases. Pretty sure if this kid needs advice about the opposite sex, she'll want it from someone who's actually been laid. She gestures vaguely at her belly, her own grin cheekier and even more mischievous than his. As much as she hates Soren's humor on most days, he's the easiest to banter with, if only because he doesn't hold back, which means there's no need for her to do so, either. She laughs at the scowl that crosses his face, but in the end, she takes a moonberry from her own bowl and tosses it into her mouth. You don't have to be able to teach her anything, you know, she says finally. You can just hang out with her, like a normal uncle. Soren huffs. That's not the point, he grumbles. I wanna have a thing, you know. Before all this, he gestures at his legs, my thing was, like, fighting, and stuff. Now I'm just, useless. He looks away, the truth of it too present for him to feign nonchalance. In the end, Rayla sighs. You're not useless, she tells him finally. You've been out here the last couple of months protecting me and the little moonbeam, and we know you'll do just the same once she's born. You already have a thing, Soren, you're her protector, and one of her godparents, and if she ever needs to, you know, talk to anyone about something Callum and I won't understand, she'll know to go to you. There's a pause. Soren still doesn't quite look at her, but she spots the flattered little smile on his lips before he straightens at last and reaches for another moonberry. It's still gonna be a nerd, you know. Rayla scoffs. There's no better partnership than a cool uncle and his nerdy niece, don't you think? No, laughs Soren. I suppose there's not. 3. What's it feel like? Claudia asks one day. They are wandering around the Moonhenge. Rayla's 34.5 weeks in now, barring any unexpected hiccups. Rowena thinks that Bub is only a week and a half away. That scares her, but it's also been 34.5 long weeks, and frankly, Rayla's done with it. It sucks, she tells Claudia honestly. It sucks and everything's sore and this kid couldn't come into the world fast enough. Claudia laughs a little at that. No, but I mean, she pauses, her lips pursed and her eyes set upwards like she's wondering how to phrase it. Isn't it amazing that you're growing someone inside of you right now? One that's half you and half Callum that'll grow up to be person all on their own. Rayla's lips twitch a little because yes, she had thought those things, after she'd come to terms with being pregnant, but before Balin and his goons decided to screw things up. The night she'd first felt the baby kick against her palm for the first time is still fresh in her memory. She'd felt it before then, but those movements were only flutterings in her stomach. Its first true kick was something different, and she still remembers the way her breath had caught in her throat and the way she'd waited for it to kick again, just to be sure, before she'd scrambled back into bed to wake Callum that night all those months ago. It is amazing, she admits quietly, her fingers drumming absently against her bump. She kicks me in weird places and it's uncomfortable and everything's just constantly sore, but it's one of those things that feels like it's worth it, you know. I think I'm just being impatient. I guess I'm just really excited to meet the little one. Is that just the polite way of saying you're sick of being pregnant? Yes, Rayla laughs. I'm sick of being huge. My ankles are swollen and my breasts are tender and I have to use the bathroom all the time. She shakes her head. The concept is amazing. The execution, not so much. Claudia hums thoughtfully. She glances skyward for a moment, her eyes sharp. Rayla knows she's looking for other shadow ravens, but there are none today, and when she turns back to her, her smile falters only a little. They've been careful about bringing Balin up around her, the sentiment is nice, but the tiptoeing is getting annoying. Rayla wishes they wouldn't. She's not so fragile that she'll have a panic attack at the thought of it. I remember when Lessa was born, Claudia says at last, purposefully dodging the subject. Rayla almost argues, but the words that follow take her mind from it altogether. Aelus used to be a healer, right? You'd think he'd be used to childbirth and stuff, but I guess it's different when it's your own wife that's doing the pushing. Rowie had to kick him out of the room. Did she, now? Rayla's lips pull upwards, amused. She's only ever seen Rowena snap a couple of times, but the idea of such a sweet, soft-spoken girl kicking an elf like Aelus out of a room is kind of hilarious. He was better when Turin came around, Claudia tells her. Do you think Callum will handle it okay? She hopes so, Rayla almost says, but the thought of labor tugs her mind back to the fact that Balin is waiting for it almost as much as she is. He's out there somewhere, at the base of the mountain, biding his time until he knows she's vulnerable, and then it's all or nothing for all of them. He'll have other things on his mind, she says at last, her tone growing clipped. Claudia hesitates. The uncertainty crosses her features faster than she can keep her face straight, and it only makes Rayla scowl. Don't even start, she grumbles. I know he's coming just as well as all of you do, but pretending he's not by avoiding the subject altogether isn't helping. Rayla, we just... I know, snaps Rayla. But, she doubles over, both arms around her bump, knees wobbling dangerously as the muscles in her belly slowly relax again. Her breathing is sharp and shallow even after the pain subsides, and when she opens her eyes, she doesn't even remember closing them. Claudia is crouched in front of her, brow furrowed in concern. Rayla groans, willing her breathing to slow. I probably deserved that, huh? Not saying yes, exactly, but this is kind of why we've been avoiding the, Balan topic. Claudia grimaces, slinging one of her arms over her shoulders and helping her carefully back onto her feet. Let's head back, okay? Yeah, breathes Rayla, wincing. Sorry, she adds. You were right. Save it for after the baby comes, chuckles Claudia. If we're all still alive after this, you mean? Don't even joke. 2. So what will the baby be, then? Ranan asks at the beginning of Rayla's 35th week. If you and Callum are prince and princess, will the baby get such a title? It's not really something she's had the chance to think about, honestly. This whole time, she's been caught up in the now of having this child, mostly because Balan and his men haven't given her a choice. At most, she knows that Bub has a claim to the Katolan throne, at least until Es has an heir of his own, which won't be for a long time yet. That means she'll have to be raised in Katolis, in the castle for most of her life, learning how to eat and sleep and walk like royalty in between traveling from city to city with her parents. It's not at all what Rayla imagined for her child, or any child she might have, for that matter. Then again, she'd never exactly imagined herself married to a prince, either, but here she is. She'll be a princess, I think, she tells Ranan at last. I'm not actually certain, but I think that's right. Ranan pauses. He's counting his arrows again. It's something Rayla's only ever seen him do a handful of times in her youth. To anyone else, he's just making sure everything's ready. To Rayla, it gives away his apprehension. His gear is always kept in good nick, always polished and accounted for and well maintained, but he counts his arrows when he's nervous because the numbers take his mind off things, and she can't even blame him for it. Will Tinker and I see much of her at all? Rayla frowns at him. Of course you will, she says. Just because she'll be raised in the castle until Es has an heir, doesn't mean we won't visit all the time. Callum and I will still be ambassadors after this. We'll still need to travel. Why would you think you wouldn't see her? Ranan sets his arrows down at last, his lips pressed tightly together in thought. It's hard, being caught between two places, he says carefully. Your child won't just be Princess of Katolis. She'll be a child of Kira too. I just hope she'll have opportunities to learn about the other half of her heritage. Rayla tilts her head at him. She won't be any less Moonshadow Elf just because she's half human. She won't be, no, says Ranan, his smile grim. It can just be hard to fit in, when she's not just a halfling, but a halfling with royal blood in a human kingdom. And I have absolute faith in you and your husband. The child's not even been born yet, and already, you'd go to the ends of the earth for her. When she comes, you and he will love this child with all your hearts, and you'll be wonderful parents to her, but it takes a village, they say. 2 villages, in this case. The other is across the border. You've thought about this a lot. More than you, I think, but only because you've been preoccupied with keeping yourself and the baby safe. Ranan chuckles at her. I understand the obligations you have to Katolis. Just bring her home to Tinker and I every once in a while, I guess. How could I do anything else? Rayla smiles at him and shifts in her chair, the baby heavy in her belly, its limbs pressing uncomfortably against her other organs. I get it. I know what it's like, to be caught between 2 sets of people, you know. But, maybe when she's old enough for it to matter, it won't be 2 sets of people anymore. Maybe this'll all blow over, and she'll grow up in a unified Zadia. Doesn't that sound nice, little one? She grins at her belly, her hope for the future for once bigger and stronger than any fears she might have of the murderer waiting for her down the mountain. You'll get to learn about everything then, all the magic, and all the cultures, and all the people in the world, and there'll be no bad men to stop you. You'll get to spend your summers with Great Uncle Ronan and Great Uncle Tinker, and you'll get to spend your downtime with Uncle Ez and Auntie Claudia and Uncle Soren in Catullus, and you'll get to see every corner of the world with me and your dad. That's the dream, huh, baby girl? Sounds nice, doesn't it? When she looks up, Ronan is watching her, a soft little smile on his lips. Sure does, he chuckles. What a dream, indeed. 1. Rayla. Hey. Are you okay? It's late, and Callum's voice is barely louder than a whisper. Rayla's 35.5 weeks in now, and the child shifts and moves within her so much that it's difficult to sleep. The last couple of nights have found her pacing up and down the sleeping quarters Luyens arranged for them, hands at the small of her back to massage away the ache of carrying her little one for so long. I'm fine, Rayla murmurs. There's no one for her to wake, the others have their own huts, courtesy of Luyens' magic, but she keeps her voice low anyway, the sound of it almost too loud in sleepy quiet of the night. I'm just sore. Can I do anything for you? Rayla shakes her head, a smile tugging at her lips. Callum's always been considerate, but she's more appreciative of it now than ever. Don't worry about me, she tells him. Go back to sleep. They're only cramps. They'll settle eventually. Or I could keep you company. His smile is tired, but genuine, and he holds out his hand, catches her fingers in his, and tugs her gently back towards the bed. Almost time, huh? Yes, snorts Rayla. She's just as done with this as I am. It's just, she trails off awkwardly, but there's no real need to finish the sentence. Balan's on Callum's mind too. They've all seen the shadow ravens, watching them from trees and circling high overhead, waiting for signs of her labor. Aunt Amaya's men have seen no physical signs of him just yet, but they know he's there all the same. What do you think our little girl will look like? Callum asks, tearing her mind away from the subject. It takes a moment for the question to make sense in Rayla's mind, the dull pain in her abdomen a little hard to think through, but when it does click, she chuckles and glances down at the swell beneath her breasts. I don't know, she says at last. I haven't really had the chance to picture her properly. I think you, says Callum. Silver hair, little nubs where her horns'll grow in, 4 tiny fingers and 4 tiny toes. His grin is infectious at this point. Rayla finds herself grinning too, despite the thought of Balan, and despite the ache in her back and belly. Kinda want her to have my eyes, though, if that's okay. She'll be so pretty, just like her mom. He presses a kiss to the back of her hands, and Rayla feels a flattered blush creeping into her cheeks at his affection. It's weird, she thinks, they've been married almost 6 months now, engaged to be married for a year before that, and overtly affectionate despite their claims that they were just friends for even longer before that. Still, he finds ways to bring redness into her cheeks and to make her giggle like a teenager, and it's nights like tonight that remind her how much he loves her, and she him. I think I'd rather she looked like you, she tells him at last. She'll still have horn nubs and 4 fingers, but she's more likely to get your brown hair and green eyes. It'd be really funny if she turned out to be a boy after all this time, huh? Rayla lets out a laugh. That might be a little awkward, she chuckles, but I don't think it'll matter in the end. I just want her healthy, and happy, and, at the end of all this, safe, you know. Her smile falls a little, her mind drifting back to the problem at hand. She will be safe, won't she? Callum nods. Of course she will be, he says quietly. We'll get him, Rayla. He'll be finished before Bub even comes into the world, and she won't ever grow up being afraid of people like him. I promise. I know. She chuckles at him despite herself, but it's replaced almost instantly by a wince as her muscles spasm once more. They're getting closer together, she manages. Rowie hasn't said anything but, oh. Callum blinks at her, uncertainty in his eyes. It's not time yet, is it? It's still early. Rayla swallows. The implication hadn't felt so heavy in her head, but out loud it makes her insides freeze up with fear. I don't know, she mumbles, doubling over as her womb clenches again, but, Rayla. Panic rises in Callum's eyes. He grimaces, crouching in front of her as she tries to catch her breath. Should I get Roe? Rayla nods wordlessly as the muscles in her belly relax enough to let her think. She counts the seconds in her head as Callum hurries out of their little hut. He's only gone maybe 100 of them, but her belly seizes again, and she knows, before Rowena even crouches in front of her, tousled and sleepy-eyed, that time's run out. She's coming now, isn't she? Manages Rayla through gritted teeth. Rowena nods, her eyes suddenly clear and hard and wide awake because she knows what else it means as much as they do. Rayla catches Callum's eye, the green of them hard and unforgiving as the thought completes itself in his mind. He sets his jaw and snatches her blades up from the nightstand. Get somewhere safe, he tells them. It's time to finish this. Notes. Game on, team. Just a little longer to go. Chapter 24. Summary. Get into position, he says quietly. Nothing gets past us, okay? Whatever happens, Rayla stays safe. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Xiv. Balan's camped out in a cave halfway up the mountain when it happens. It's late. A little before midnight probably. The waning crescent moon is high in the sky, the fresh snow on the mountainside shining silver in its weak light. He's had shadow ravens flying over the moon nexus for weeks now, watching in his stead, waiting for the most opportune moment to strike, and when he hears them caw at him that night, and he shuts his eyes to look through theirs, he sees the midwife ushering the elf into the safety of the mountain, hand on her belly and instructing her to breathe, and he laughs. He tosses another log into the fire. Waits until it's high and happy before he takes the clay pot from his pack and empties its contents into the flames. She thought she'd rid me of an army, he scoffs. Shaforet Nelith, Ares Niagara. Wodas Sriad loss. The physical effort it takes to conjure them is immense. Balan feels the ache in his head well before the figures rise around him, but he ignores it, his focus, instead, on the bodies of his men, resurrected by their own ashes and the crushed bones of Azadian pale horse. No mistakes this time, he mutters, turning his eyes to the mountaintop. Kill the others. Leave the prince and the elf to me. The shadows leap into the night. It's a rush to wake everyone. Callum feels the exhaustion gnawing at him in his stomach, but his apprehension all but drowns it. He hasn't slept properly in days, a combination of the fact that Rayla's spent the last couple of nights shifting uneasily in bed beside him, and of the knowledge that Balan is out there, lurking in the darkness, ready to strike her down. He sends Claudia and Luyan after her and Rowena, their final line of defense in case he and the others can't bring Balan down, and as much as he wishes he could be there with them, his single priority right now is to make sure Balan doesn't come anywhere near his wife and child. He grips her blades in his hands, his palms sweaty against their hilts, his heart hammering away in his throat as he paces up and down the grounds. Maybe he's not coming, says Soren. There's tension in his shoulders, and the cocky grin on his lips is obviously fake. It's a poor attempt to settle Callum's nerves, but an attempt nonetheless. Callum would be grateful for it any other day, he thinks, but the way he fiddles with his vial of potent serum only reminds him that Soren's confidence is feigned. Maybe he doesn't know. Don't be an idiot, snaps Callum. It comes out harsher than he intends, and he relents. He's had those shadow ravens watching us for weeks now. Of course he knows. Fretting won't do you any good, says Ranan pointedly, thumbing through his quiver of arrows as he counts them once more. You'll need a clear head tonight. Rayla's relying on you. That only makes the churning in Callum's stomach worse. In all the years he's known her, Rayla's never had to rely on anyone for protection, let alone him, and in the months that she has, he's done nothing but fail her. He'd given her the thing that allowed Balan to find her. He hadn't been there when she needed him most. Even now, he's waiting out here with Ranan and Soren, instead of with her for the most vulnerable moments of her life. He won't fail her again. He can't. His grip tightens around her blades. They feel heavy in his hands, foreign, almost, even though he's grown used to handling them. He feels something build on the tip of his tongue, a response, probably, but Commander Gren coughs as he approaches them, his armor clanking with every step. Your Highness, he says, bowing his head a little. There's movement at the base of the mountain. We think he's here. Behind Callum, Soren and Ragnar exchange glances. Then Soren uncaps the vial. "Cheers," he says, swallowing half the fluid in one go. He tosses what's left of it to Ragnar. Ragnar eyes it with a wrinkle across his nose, reluctant to accept it from Soren, of all people, and to admit that he even needs it, but he catches Callum's eye, their joint concern for Rayla more pressing than his need to maintain his pride. He sighs. "Cheers," he grumbles, downing the rest. Callum nods at them both. The gravity of this isn't lost on him. 4.5 years ago, they were on opposite sides, and Ragnar was on a mission to murder his stepfather while Soren took a stand against him. To see them sharing a vial of potent serum in Rayla's defense is something else. He offers them a twitch of his lips, the closest thing to a grin he can manage, and huffs. "Get into position," he says quietly. "Nothing gets past us, okay? Whatever happens, Rayla stays safe." They nod. Ragnar slings his quiver onto his back. Soren unsheathes Rayla's sunforge blade. "Rayla stays safe," they agree. They promise. Callum holds them to it. The way Balon's heard it, the Moon Nexus is a cluster of ruins, thousands of years old, sacred to Moon Shadow Elves, and guarded by monsters and unspeakable terrors. How appropriate, he thinks. It's fitting that the elf should make her last stand up there, if it's much of a last stand at all. She's weak, and that makes her prince weak, and that's just all the better for him. Something's not quite right about it, though. He'd expected some resistance on the way up. He'd expected some sort of defense designed to wear him out before he even got to the top of the mountain. But there's nothing. Not even twitch of movement out of the corner of his eye. The slopes are barren and empty as he scales them, so much so that a part of him wonders if the elf and her friends are even up there at all. He shakes his head. Of course they are. Dark magic doesn't lie, and his maps say she's there, so she must be. The silence on the mountain puts goosebumps on the back of his neck, the deadness of it eerie and threatening in itself, but he presses on anyway, wondering if his army of shadow soldiers are in position already. This was always supposed to be a trap. He'd known that from the beginning. He knows it now, and it feels far too much like that night at the Bantha Lodge to be anything else. When he reaches the top, he's greeted, again, by nothing. There's no prince. No Amaya and her retinue of guards. Only darkness stretching over the stone ruins and worn dirt paths. "You made it, General." That voice makes him snarl. He spins, eyes flitting wildly in their sockets, and when he spots her, he feels his hackles rising at how casually she sits upon a boulder at the edge of the wood. She's not as composed as the last time, the silver of her hair is dark with sweat, there's a tightness in her jaw that gives away her exhaustion, a patch of wetness in the skirt of her dress that tells him exactly what's going on. Balon scowls at her. He tugs the crossbow off his belt and fires a bolt at her, knowing it'll miss but hoping, secretly, that it won't. But it passes through her chest, and she only rolls her eyes, a grim smirk tugging at her lips. "Wasting no time, I see." He snorts. "Coward," he seethes. Says the man intent on killing a pregnant elf while she's laboring, says the elf dryly. He hears the hitch in her breath and the tremble in her voice, sees the little twitch of the muscles in her cheek, and he wonders how hard it is for her to concentrate on facing him like this. "You really are pathetic," she says. "Who puts this much effort into being such an awful person?" He sneers at her. "An awful person," he scoffs. "As if you and your people aren't just the same. You're murderers. All of you. What's one monster killing another?" "Pathetic," the elf repeats. "That's what's so interesting about being a person, you know. You don't have to be stupid about this. You can choose to let this go. You don't have to do this." Balon barks out a laugh. "Is this your way of begging me to spare you?" The snorts at him. "It's your last warning," she says, the lilac of her eyes glinting dangerously in the pale moonlight, even in spite of the work it must be taking to remain so composed. "Do not forget who you're dealing with tonight. If you choose to do this, you will die." "What a funny thing to say from someone in labor," scoffs Balon. "You know what your chances are out here, don't you? I might not even have to kill you myself." "You'd better hope that's the case," snaps the elf. "Because if, somehow, We're both still alive after all of this. I will hunt you down and end you personally. I'm quaking in my boots, snorts Balin, unflinching in the face of her threats. Can't say I didn't warn you. She smirks at him one final time before the image of her fades like dye in water. Balin watches the last wisps of her disappear into the darkness before he hears it, the light footfalls of someone attempting to sneak up on him, the metallic sheeing of a rune being drawn into the air. There's only one person it could be. Balin reacts on instinct. He turns. Reaches into his pack for the shriveled paw in the front pocket and mutters, "Les et Eshov." The magical green hand materializes in his palm. It's too fast for even Callum and his practiced hands, zipping past the shimmering, unfinished rune and into his throat. Recognition dawns on his face as his voice leaves him, gripped tightly in the fist of Balin's spell. Balin smirks. "It's a little harder to cast magic without a voice, isn't it, Your Highness?" Callum scowls at him, but he waves the rune aside and reaches behind him instead. Balin recognizes the movement too late. It's the same one the elf uses to unsheath her blades, and Callum has both in his hands, flicked into their sword forms, before he remembers that she'd taught him how to use them almost as adept as her. He draws his sword in time to parry Callum's first blow and dodges out of the way of the second, the shriveled paw still clutched tightly in his left hand. He tries to strike back, but Callum ducks below his blade, sweeping a leg under his, and Balin stumbles, breaking his fall with a roll. "Very good, Your Highness," he snarls. "She's taught you well, hasn't she?" Callum's lips twitch dangerously, his eyes flitting to Balin's closed fist. Balin knows what he wants immediately, knows that the fastest way to end this is with magic and that Callum can't do it without a voice. It makes him want to laugh. He raises a hand, his shadow soldiers appearing at the signal, their bodies pulsing with dark magic. He thinks he sees something like panic flash in Callum's eyes, and then he does laugh. "Are you worried yet, Your Highness?" Callum snorts at him, a mirthless grin spreading across his lips. He tosses both his weapons into the ground, blades first, and signs something into the air. "About you?" "Yes." Balin knows that voice too. When he turns again, he finds himself and his soldiers surrounded, with General Amaya and Commander Gren blocking his path back down the mountain. The soldier boy's there too, Sunforge blade in hand and at the ready, along with another Moonshadow elf, one whose resemblance to their so-called princess is evident only in the shape of his jaw. "This is your last chance to back off," Balin Gren says, this time on behalf of Amaya. "Surrender." "I thought better of you, Amaya." "I never did," of you, sneers Gren, watching Amaya's hands. "Surrender." Balin eyes them all. Part of him almost wants to. Somewhere in his heart, he knows that it'll take a miracle to get out of this alive, and perhaps it might be easier to give it all up now. But he looks at their faces, their eyes hard and unforgiving, and for what? An elf. A cold-blooded, murderous elf who deserves nothing more than to die at his hand after what her people did to him and his family. It disgusts him. He grips his sword tighter, and the severed paw tighter still. "I'll surrender when that whore is dead," he barks. He nods at his soldiers. "Kill them all." X. Rayla's eyes snap open, a strangled cry escaping her throat as pain spasms through her belly. Claudia's behind her, glowing primal stone in one hand, her fingers squeezed tightly in the other, offering what little support she can in Callum's stead. Rowena is kneeling in front of her, hands on her knees, her jaw tight with apprehension. Luyan is a little way away drawing runes into the air for protection. They're on the stone balcony overlooking the lake. It's the furthest from the danger they'd managed before Rayla's water had broken and Rowena had decided it was far enough. He's there now, Rayla manages through gritted teeth. The pain makes it hard to think, hard to breathe, and Claudia's magic had come at a cost. It had worn her ragged last time, but she's laboring now, and the added stress on her body has made her weak. "Tell me it's time." "Not quite," says Rowena, glancing between her legs again. She's frowning a little. It makes Rayla wonder if something's not quite right, but her focus stays on the job. "You gotta hang on a little bit longer, okay?" Rayla groans, her breaths tired and heavy. She leans her head back against Claudia's shoulder, fighting the pain and the exhaustion until a sob forces its way out of her lips. "Moon above, it hurts, and there's nothing she can do about it." "Chew on this," she hears Luyan say. It'll help the pain. Vaguely, Rayla registers something being placed between her teeth. The taste of bark fills her mouth, and she grimaces and clutches at Claudia's fingers tighter still. A haze follows, though, and while tears leak from the corners of her eyes with the next contraction, the pain feels distant. Almost there, she hears Rowena say again. "Hang in there, princess. It's almost time." Gods, Rayla hopes so, but the words don't quite make it out of her mouth. She only sobs. X. The fighting breaks out around them, but Callum hardly notices it. Dimly, he's aware that Aunt Amaya, and Commander Gren, and Soren, and Ronan are around him, taking the brunt of Balan's shadow soldiers, but all he knows is that Balan is keeping him from being with his wife again and that this needs to end. His voice is still in Balan's fist, and Callum knows that, even with two swords over Balan's one, it'll be harder fight to win. Meanwhile, Rayla is laboring, the danger of it not lost of him even if Rowena and Luyan are with her, and there's part of him that's terrified, not of Balan, but of the idea that she might not make it out of this even if they do stop him. The thought angers him, and Callum skulls, tugging Rayla's blades out of the grass to hold them in front of him, at the ready. He jerks his head at Balan, a taunt, a dare, an unspoken "let's finish this, then," and Balan lunges. Callum parries the blow, rolls out of the way with a huff, strikes back with one, and then both blades, but Balan's too fast for him, even in his old age. It's like he's stronger, somehow, as if he's borrowed power from something else, just for this, and then Callum realizes that he probably has. There's a look in his eye that's almost unhinged. He's not quite himself anymore, and of course he's not. He's been dabbling in dark magic all year, and he doesn't exactly have the willpower of someone like Claudia. Claudia had known it took patience to learn how to properly wield something as dangerous as dark magic. It took its toll on her, but her ideologies, her belief in the idea that what she was doing was right kept her sane for long enough to figure out that it wasn't. Balan has none of that. His disposition is comparatively weak, and that strengthens Callum's resolve. He charges at him, Rayla's blades whistling through the air as he swings them to meet Balan's. He dodges, parries, lunges, and keeps his eyes locked on the closed fist the whole time, his goal singular and obvious until it costs him. He doesn't see Balan's knee coming until it's in his stomach, and the wind rushes out of him, giving Balan an opening to send him crashing to the ground. Callum wheezes, his breath short and ragged, as Balan looms towards him, mad grin on his face. Weak, he scoffs. You were supposed to have defeated Viren, but you're nothing without magic, are you? He raises his sword, and Callum's eyes widen. He rolls out of the way just as the sword plunges into the ground where his chest might have been barely seconds before. He scoots back along the grass, still struggling to get up, to breathe. He catches sight of Aunt Amaya and Commander Gren, back to back and surrounded, at Soren, whose exhaustion is starting to show, at Ronan, who's been forced backwards in an effort to keep those shadow soldiers away from Rayla. Breathe, he thinks. Breathe. Come on, breathe. X. Breathe, princess, it's almost time, okay? Just a little. Rowena cuts herself off. Rayla almost doesn't notice between the pain and bark in her teeth, but it's the paleness of Rowena's face that gets her. She's been around too long now for Rayla not to notice the subtle changes in her posture and the little grimace that crosses her face, even in the midst of her labor. What's happening, she manages. Rowena exchanges concerned glances with Claudia, and then with Luyan before she chooses her words carefully. It's going to be fine, she says, but even Rayla doesn't miss the way her voice shakes. She lifts Rayla's skirt higher, and almost too late, Rayla realizes that there's blood, her blood, on her fingers. Her breath stalls. Rowie, what's happening? Rowena presses her lips together. In spite of her professionalism, in spite of the way Rayla can practically see the way she's weighing her options in her head, there's fear there. They're too far out from the nearest town to get help if they need it. There's only so much she can do with the limited supplies that she has. She takes a breath. Listen to me, princess, she says finally. You're bleeding again, and we need to deliver this baby as fast as we can, okay? We can't wait any longer, so you're gonna push with your next contraction, yeah? Rowie, what's wrong? It's Claudia who asks this time, and Rayla can't see her face, but the tightness of her grip around her fingers betrays her concern. Is everything okay? Is the baby okay? Bub's going to be fine, says Rowena quickly. The rest of the placentas come away early, I think. She swallows. It's hard to tell without Alis. She's dilated enough now. We just have to be fast. Okay, princess. Breathe for me, it's time to push now. Ready. The contraction starts. Rayla lets out a cry. She pushes. X. An arrow thuds into Balan's armor. Callum glances up. Ranan already has a second arrow knocked, and he gives Callum a look as he dodges a blow from a shadow soldier. Rayla stays safe. He looses it, and Callum kicks out at Balan's knees and sends him stumbling into the ground. His fist stays closed, but the promise he'd made, the one they'd all made, renews his resolve. Rayla stays safe. Callum lunges. Flicks one of Rayla's blades into its hook form and catches Balan's cape with it. Drags him back unceremoniously until, in his desperation, Balan drops the shriveled paw in his fist. Callum's voice comes back with his first full breath. He gasps. He coughs. He skulls. You're going to wish you had a tighter grip. Balan skulls back at him, tearing his ruined cape off his shoulders and letting it flutter to the ground. You think I'm afraid of you, he snarls, opening his pack for a dried tentacle. Sif Midnab, he whispers. A burst red light shines from his palm, and the next thing Callum knows is pressure, around his neck, and over his chest, and around his spine. The tendril of dark magic squeezes, cutting his breath off for the second time tonight. He claws at it with one hand, but his fingers pass through it like it's nothing and he feels his nails scrabbling against his own skin instead. Balan's grinning maniacally as he steps towards him, the whites of his eyes still black with dark magic, his arm outstretched and his fingers crooked around the tentacle like it's Callum's throat. Desperate and gasping, he grips Rayla's blade in his other hand, flips his hold on it and points it down, and slices. Balan lets out a howl. He drops the tentacle, blood pouring from his arm, and Callum crashes to the ground. Callum doesn't wait this time. He scribbles a rune into the air, casting orange light across the grounds, and he rasps, Ignis. Flames roar to life in his hands and he thrusts his palm outward, aiming not at Balan, but at the pack at his side. The leather catches fire like it's doused in turpentine. Balan yelps, swearing as he struggles to remove it, but the damage is done. His ingredients are gone. His spellbook is gone. His shadow soldiers still. They don't crumble, but without his pack and his books, Balan has no control over them, his connection to them gone with the rest of his borrowed power. Their glowing purple eyes turn to him, waiting for orders that he can't now give them, and Callum fights the urge to laugh. He stalks forward, seething and exhausted, knocking Balan's sword out of his hand as he raises it with a lazy swipe of the blade he still has in one hand. He tosses Rayla's sword into the ground, seizes the older man around the collar and drags him to his feet, and slams a fist into his cheek. Balan crumples to the ground. Vaguely, Callum registers his friends stilling around him, but he almost doesn't care. This bastard has come too close to hurting his wife and child one too many times, and he's done being patient and forgiving about it. You should have surrendered, he snarls, advancing even as Balan scrambles away. You would have had a better chance facing the gallows. Are you going to kill me then, spits Balan, blood on his lip. You haven't exactly given me a choice. Balan barks out a laugh, blood and saliva spraying outwards as he tries to shuffle away. His eyes are wild. Desperate. Callum almost feels sorry for him as he stumbles clumsily back onto his feet. He smirks. Are you really going to waste time with me, he says. Callum snarls at him. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Balan's smirk grows wider. Isn't your wife in labor at this very moment? Callum. That's Soren. He steps forward, Ayla's sunforge blade hanging limply at his side, his armor battered, his face covered in a sheen of sweat and soot. He's taunting you. End this. But Balan ignores him, the desperation in his eyes growing closer to mad with every passing second. It'd be a shame if, after all this, neither of them made it anyway. Her chances out here aren't so good, and you know that, don't you, Your Highness? The words make Callum swallow. He knows what this is. He's not an idiot. It's Balan's last-ditch attempt to stay alive, to be handed over to Aunt Amaya and her men to face a trial instead of dying here and now. Part of him wants to just do it, to end this, once and for all, and to guarantee the safety of his child with his own hands, but Rayla bursts into his mind, the image of blood on her shift sending ice through his veins. He hesitates, and for the first time, his eyes flit away from Balan and towards the recesses of the Nexus. X. Bub's crowning, princess, push. Rayla shakes her head. Her throat is sore. Her vision is blurring. Her fingers are numb from clutching Claudia's. I can't, she whines weakly. I can't do it. Yes, you can, urges Claudia, although she sounds probably even more terrified than Rayla feels. You can do it. Come on, Rayla, you're almost there. We need to get Bub out of there now, princess, push. Rayla does. A hoarse cry leaves her lips with it as she feels the head of her baby pass through her loins at long last, but there's no wail. Silence hangs in the air in between her heaving breaths and Claudia's encouragement. Luyan presses her fingers to her lips. Rayla, push. X. I remember what it was like, sneers Balan. The loss. I did everything I could for them, and in the end, they died anyway. Different circumstances, but still. You and I are the same in that way, your highness. I'm nothing like you, snaps Callum, the hilt of Rayla's blade digging into his fingers. No, agrees Balan with a smirk. You're better than me. In every way. You should be with your wife right now, not here. Callum. That's Soren again, but he sounds distant. Balan's starting to sound distant too. Callum glances in the direction of the Moonhenge once more, his breath heavy as it leaves his lips. All there is in his mind is Rayla and the baby. What's it going to be, your highness, says Balan. How much more time will you waste on me? Callum doesn't even get to respond, Aunt Amaya's too fast for him. Her movements are graceful, even as she backhands him so hard that his cheek splits and he folds onto the ground. When she turns to Callum again, her jaw is set, the hazel of her eyes hard. Go, she signs. We'll take care of this. Callum doesn't need to be told twice. He stumbles over his own feet as sprints towards the center of the Nexus, tripping over cracks in the ruins and over stones in the path. Rayla and the baby are at the forefront of his mind, but when he finds them at last, his heart stops. There's no cry. No telltale wail of a newborn child. Only Rayla, sobbing and shuddering as Rowena tugs an unbreathing baby from between her legs. It's done, Rowena says Luyan, gently, but the young midwife snarls at her. Bag, she snaps. There's so much ferocity in her voice that for a moment, Luyan only stares. Now. Luyan blinks, but she nudges the pack towards her anyway. Rowena's movements are swift. Practiced. Professional, and something like hope bubbles in Callum's chest when she clears the child's airways and begins to pump lightly at her chest. Come on, baby girl, she coaxes. Just a little breath. Come on. Dad's here now too. Come on. There's maybe a half a minute of silence, before the baby hiccups. It's so weak, Callum almost doesn't hear it, but Rowena's face splits into a grin, and Rayla's breath hitches in her throat, and then there's a wail. Moon above. Rayla lets out a sob. Behind her, Claudia's shoulders slump, her eyes filling with tears of relief. Oh my God, she chokes. Oh my gods, that was terrifying. Callum's knees almost buckle, but Rowena grins at him, and then at Rayla, and he does the only thing that makes sense. He stumbles forward speechlessly, tugging his scarf from his neck to proffer it stupidly at Rowena. She takes it with a laugh, wrapping it deftly around his wriggling, wailing daughter before she shuffles forwards on her knees and presses the baby gently into Rayla's arms. It feels like someone's got his voice again, even as falls to his knees beside his wife and child to press relieved and grateful kisses into both their foreheads. She looks like him, Callum notes vaguely. Just a little tuft of brown hair on her head, tiny curved ears, and nubs where her horns will grow in, and gods, he doesn't think he's ever seen anything so beautiful in his life. You stubborn thing, mumbles Rayla, sniffling. Hi there, baby girl. Dad and I are so pleased to meet you. You gave us a heck of a scare there. Did you get him? Asks Claudia quietly. Callum nods. Yeah, he croaks. He's up. He's done. Aunt Amaya's going to make sure of it. He lets out a breath, smooths his daughter's hair out of her face, and chokes out a sigh. You're okay now, lovely, he whispers. Sorry, he corrects too late. Everything's going to be just fine. Notes. Is this a mess? I don't know. I've been on nights and I haven't slept properly in like 2 days. I'm just so done with this fic tbh, ha ha ha. Current status, waiting for any midwives or doctors to come and tell me how much I fucked up. Chapter 25. Summary. The world can wait for once. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. XXV. I want to talk to him. Callum stares. It's been a couple of days now. Rayla's on her feet again already, against her better judgment and against Rowena's advice, but she says it makes the ache between her legs easier to deal with and that she's been inactive long enough. They're in their hut tonight, and she's pacing, wincing a little as she goes, with little sorry I bundled carefully against her chest. To who? To Balin. She nods. There's a hardness in her features when she answers, but she allows none of it to seep into her voice, afraid she might wake Sorry. He's still here, isn't he? Aunt Amaya and the others haven't left yet. He is, in a magical prison of Callum's own making, and under constant surveillance from Aunt Amaya and her men. There's a cell waiting for him in the castle that probably won't be his home for very long, but transporting someone like Balin is dangerous, even without his books and his borrowed magic. Aunt Amaya wants to guarantee that he's put away for good, and she wants her men fully recuperated to do it. There's a part of Callum that wishes they didn't have to wait at all. He should have ended it then. He shouldn't have listened. But he thinks about what he might have missed if he hadn't left when he had. Thinks about what might have happened if Rowena hadn't managed to resuscitate Sorry. In the end, he thinks that this is for the better. Still, he cocks his head uncertainly at Rayla, not so sure that facing him so soon after the birth of their daughter is such a good idea. She's not weak. She's never been weak. But she is recovering from one of the most harrowing experiences of her life, and for once, he wishes that she would just rest. But that's not her. Rayla has always been headstrong and stubborn and fiercely protective of the people she loves, and he can't keep her from facing him no matter how much he wants to. The most he can do is face him with her. In the morning, he promises. Before they go, he offers her a smile, catching her hand as she comes close, her fingers still a perfect fit against his. Sorry, stirs a little, and Callum's smile grows wider. She's doing so well, he murmurs. Aren't you, lovely? Our little moonbeam. The hardness in Rayla's face falters, the lilac of her eyes soft and shining as she turns them to the baby tucked against her chest. She's so pretty. Just like her mum, Callum chuckles, his voice low. He touches her cheek with gentle fingers, hardly daring to believe that she's really there after all this time. It's amazing how much of them is in her. She looks like him at first glance, yes, his hair, and his nose, and his rounded ears, but her eyes and the paleness of her skin are Rayla's, and unmistakably so. Rayla presses her lips shut hesitantly. She takes a breath. I keep wanting to check that she's breathing, she confesses after a moment. She'll go to sleep for a minute and I get it. He huffs, relieved that he isn't the only one. She's so small, so delicate, but she's so like her mother already, headstrong and stubborn in all the same ways, and he knows with a surety he can't explain that she's going to be just fine, even if he does hesitate until he sees her chest rising and falling with every tiny breath. But she's a fighter, just like you. She's gonna be okay. I know. Rayla presses a kiss against her forehead, the corners of her lips tucked into a smile so full of love that it fills Callum's whole being with warmth. She nods at his arms, holding Sorry out to him so she can rest her own, and he takes her gladly and without complaint. It's not the first time he's held his baby girl, but he imagines having her in his arms is something he'll never tire of. She's so light that he wonders, again, if she really is there. He prods her nose, chuckling to himself when she scrunches her eyes together at the sensation, her tiny four-fingered hands grasping clumsily at his thumb as he runs his fingers across her cheeks. Gods, she's perfect. More perfect than he ever thought was possible, and she's only a couple of days old, but he loves her so much already. When he glances up, he finds Rayla smiling at him, looking as if she wants to say something but she's not sure what. In the end, she shakes her head and brings her forehead to his, their noses pressed together in chaste affection, her breath mingling lightly with his own. "I love you," she mumbles at last. "Both of you." "We know," chuckles Callum. "Don't we?" "Sorry, And we love Mum too, very, very much." It means nothing to her just yet, of course, but she shifts anyway, comforted by the voices of her parents, and the warmth and security of her father's arms. They see Aunt Amaya and her men off at dawn. She kisses her new grandniece goodbye with a smile, and with a promise to make sure the bad man goes away for good, but to Callum and Rayla, she signs something else. "You wanted to talk to him?" she asks Rayla. Rayla nods, her shoulders stiffening a little, her arms tightening ever so slightly around her baby girl. Aunt Amaya nods, and she beckons them both to the windowless wagon chained to her own and Gren's horses. She raps twice against the door and slides a hatch open, barely large enough to fit an arm through, but it's enough. Balin squints against the light, scowling at the sight of them and at the little bundle in Rayla's arms. "So you're both alive then," he sneers. "Sorry to disappoint you, but yes," snaps Rayla. He can't do anything to them now. Aunt Amaya and Callum had personally made sure of it, but she feels Callum's fingers twitching by her side anyway, at the ready, just in case. "I hope it was worth it to you. All of this. It's cost you your life." "There'll be others," he snorts. "Ideas are harder to kill than me, your highnesses. This piece you're so proud of won't last. Pity I won't be around to see it crumble." Rayla scoffs at him. "You really are just a sad old man, aren't you? Wonder what your son would think of you now." That stalls him. His eyes widen, just a bit, and something like confusion crosses his face before it's replaced by rage. He starts forward, but a chain in the center of the wagon stops him short and he stumbles. "General Amaya told us," says Rayla mildly. "How you sent him to the breach, and that he died because of your want for power. He was a sweet kid, according to her. He didn't want to be there to begin with, but you sent him anyway. He didn't deserve that. He didn't deserve you. Your people murdered him," he snarls, spraying blood and spit at them through the opening in the wagon. "You're all monsters. You killed him." "No," says Rayla. "That was you. Goodbye, Balin." She nods at Aunt Amaya, and she slides the hatch shut until all that's left of Balin is the sound of him struggling against his chains in the wagon. "Ezran may want to wait until you're both back in the city before a formal execution," she signs. "We'll keep an eye on him in the meantime. He won't see the light of day again, you have my word." "Thanks, Aunt Amaya," signs Callum. "Travel safe." She nods, offering them a short bow before she pulls both of them into a gentle hug. Then she climbs onto her horse, Gren at her side, and flicks the reins. The wagon lurches, they hear Balin stumble inside it, and Callum slips an arm around Rayla's waist until they disappear down the slopes of the mountain. "Are you okay?" he asks after a moment. Rayla breathes in. When the breath comes out again, it does so in a rush, her back slumping heavily with it, but she leans her head against his shoulder and nods. "Yeah," she whispers. "I am now." It's the darkness that gets him. There's no alcohol in it to keep his mind off his faults and failures, nothing to distract him from the fact that he's going to die in a few days when he doesn't even know that they are passing. His face aches from the cuts and bruises Callum and Amaya had put into it, his wrists are raw from rubbing against the shackles chaining him to the ground, and when they get to the capital at last, they throw him into another cell, not so different from the one he was already in. The lack of stimuli drives him mad. Balin half wonders if he already was to begin with. He sees faces in the stones of his cell. The elves. Callum's. Amaya's. Taunting him until he wishes they would end his misery already and be done with it. It's Ayla's face that convinces him he's lost his mind. "You did this," she seems to say, her voice airy and far away. She'd hated him towards the end, but Balin never forgot the sound of her voice. It's almost a comfort. "So I did," he rasps. It's been days since he's spoken to anyone and his throat is dry with disuse. "What for?" Balin snorts at her. At himself. He might be mad, but not quite mad enough to believe she's really there. I did it for you, he spits. And for Lynette. Those monsters are the reason you're dead. I won't bow to one and her abomination of a child. Alis tilts her head at him, the hazel of her eyes is clear even in the darkness of his cell. She regards him with pity, the same sneer etched on her features when she looked at him while she was alive. It infuriates him. You did it for yourself, she corrects. We never would have wanted this, but that didn't matter to you, did it? Shut up. She smirks. You really are just a sad old man, aren't you? Shut up. He's still shackled, but he has movement enough to seize the undrunk cup of water at his feet. He hurls it across the cell with a snarl, and Alis disappears, leaving him alone in the darkness once more. When Amaya's men come for him, he's almost relieved. Any longer in that cell would have had him clawing at his own eyes and ears in an effort to unsee the faces that taunt him in the dark, but it wouldn't have mattered. He sees them when he closes his eyes as well. It would only have been a more painful way to die, and he'd rather hang than listen to those voices any more than he already has. Ezran doesn't bother with a trial this time. They know he's guilty. He might as well have admitted to his crimes the night he'd arrived on the mountain with his army of shadow soldiers and his sword in hand. Good, he thinks. No more of this. He's not afraid, he thinks. His knees are weak as Amaya's men lead him through the stone passages of the castle, but that's because of disuse and malnourishment. He's not afraid, and he won't give Callum or the elf the satisfaction of even thinking it. It's dusk when they finally reach the courtyard. Balin breathes in the air, knowing it's the last he'll ever do it, savoring the cold as it fills his lungs. There's no crowd. Only Ezran on the balcony, with his brother and the elf, and their little mismatched group of friends. They watch him with disgust. He can almost see Alis in their faces, the hardness in their eyes so reminiscent of the contempt she'd held for him. He holds his head high at the sight of them, refusing to bow, refusing to let them believe they've won, even as Amaya's men shove him onto a platform in the middle of the courtyard. Then there's a bag over his head, and a noose around his neck, and the executioner asks him, "Have you any last words?" He wants to snort. To laugh at how ludicrous it is that they think he would have any last words for them. But in the darkness of the bag, he sees something else, another face, one that stills his heart and puts ice in his veins. Lynette, he mumbles. He hears the executioner pause, but it's not him Balin cares about. It's the golden-haired image of the boy in the material of the bag. His son come to remind him of his failures at last. Something breaks within him. His throat closes. His hands tremble in their binds behind his back. You did this, Lynette whispers sadly. Those elves didn't kill me. You did. Yes, Balin mutters, his breath shuddering. I did. The floor falls away. That's done, then. Ez's jaw is set. His stomach churns a little in guilt, but he looks at Rayla and the child in her arms and reminds herself of what the dead man in the courtyard had tried to do, and would have done again if anyone had given him the chance. Sorry, I's a couple of weeks old now, and it had taken him that long to decide for himself that this was the right thing to do. He imagines what might be like if he hadn't done it. Imagines the future of his niece if she were constantly dogged by fear. This is for the best, he tells himself once more, and he shakes off his guilt and ushers everyone back into the keep. Are you okay? Asks Rayla quietly, setting a hand against his shoulder. She's wearing the sling Alis and his family had sent her. Sorry, I's fussing in it, and she rolls her eyes at her baby and rubs gently at her back. Motherhood suits her, Ezran thinks, and he reminds himself again that Balin had tried to take this away from her to strengthen his resolve. I'm fine, he says. He takes a breath. We had to do it. He didn't give us a choice. You don't have to pretend that you're okay about this, Ez. Callum sets his hand on his shoulder too, a frown set into the corners of his lips. It's a hard decision to make, no matter how much you think that it's the right thing to do. Ez chuckles in spite of himself. I'll be okay, he mumbles. It's part of being king, I guess. Ruling was always gonna be hard. I'm just glad you guys are here to help me with it. Always, bud. Callum offers him a smile. If you need anything, if you just want to talk, just say the word. We'll be here. Actually. Ez pauses. He looks between them carefully, wondering if this is the right time or place, but sucks in a breath anyway, wanting to clear the issue from his head. I never got you guys anything. For sorry I mean. The last few months have been such a mess, and I spent ages trying to find something you guys could use that you didn't already have, and... Ez. Rayla makes a face at him. You didn't have to get us anything. We don't need anything else. Ez shakes his head. You need some time off, I think. From everything. Just to, be a family for a while. And he pauses again, but this time he plunges a hand into his pocket to fish out a key. The Bantha Lodge is gone now, but we fixed something else up for you over there. You don't have to take it, but it's yours if you want it. I thought that, if you ever needed some time away from the castle, or from your jobs as ambassadors, you might want somewhere you can hide away. Callum's still frowning at him, but it's a different kind of frown now. It's probably closer to confused than anything else, and Ezran lets out a snort and presses the key into his palm. Just go check it out, he says. I promise it's worth it. It's a cottage. Nothing as big as the Bantha Lodge, just a little stone one on the bank of the river. It's simple, charming, even, with its stumpy chimney and lead-lined windows and its water wheel around the back. Callum climbs off Vorobe, takes Sarai from Rayla so she can climb off Kuritsa a little easier, and together, they crunch through the fresh fallen snow before Callum unlocks the door to let them in. The warmth hits them like a brick wall. It's cozy inside, and furnished comfortably enough without being too over the top. There's a stock of firewood stacked up against the wall, a cushioned chaise in the living room, even a nursery with a little crib in the room across from, presumably, their own. Peace and quiet isn't something Callum's had time to think much about over the last few months, but now that he's here, he feels a sigh leave his lips, relieved and so grateful for Ezran's consideration. He sags into the chaise, his limbs like lead, Sarai tucked against his chest as Rayla stares around the cottage open-mouthed and breathless. This is nice, she manages in the end. Nice is an understatement, says Callum, slumping against the backrest. Gods, they needed this. He just hadn't realized how much. Oh. Callum blinks. He shuffles against the chaise, leaning his head over the backrest to see Rayla picking a letter deftly off the dining room table. Is that a letter? I think so. Rayla clucks her tongue and breaks the seal. To Callum and Rayla she reads. These last few months sucked. I'm sorry that everything got as complicated as it did, and that you had so much to deal with during such a delicate time. Mostly I'm sorry that you guys didn't get to have your little moonbeam in peace. All you've ever done since you even met is try to make the world a better place, and you both deserve some time to just be, So we fixed up this cottage for you. Anya wanted to help, you never got her gift, apparently, and a cottage seemed like too big a present from just one person, so think of it as a joint gift from the kingdoms of Duran and Katolis. Sorry, I doesn't know it yet, but she's the luckiest little girl in the world to have the two of you as parents. You're both so good, and you've barely had her a couple of weeks and already, you've gone to hell and back, just to keep her safe. She'll grow up in a better world than we had because of you. She'll grow up knowing peace and friendship between elves and humans, and more importantly, she'll grow up knowing what Dad believed in, that history is a narrative of love. So take some time away. Just be a family for a while. You deserve it. The world can wait for once. Lots of love, Ezran and Anya. Rayla draws in a breath. She presses her lips together as she rolls the parchment back up and slumps into a dining room chair, a soft sort of peace set into the line of her lips. She sets the letter down again, blinking at their cottage, their home, like she doesn't quite believe that they really can rest now, even if it's only for a little while. Callum sighs. Ez really thought of everything, huh? Yes, says Rayla, hiding a smile behind her fingers. He did. Notes. I have to be up in 5 hours lol, but this came out so smoothly and I'm just so emotional that we got this far. Thank you so much for putting up with me, team. Just one more to bring it home. Chapter 26. Summary. Hiding away again, are we? Teases Uncle Ez. It's very late, you know. What are the guards going to tell your mom? Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 16. 6 years later. Sorry, I seen a lot of the world in her 6 years. She's been to the ports in the human city of Varana, seen the bustling markets in the border town of Fimita, had picnics with mum and dad in the gardens of Erin, but if she had to pick the place she likes best, not counting dad's workshop, of course, then there's nothing quite like Uncle Ez's castle. The other castles in the human kingdoms are okay. She likes the one in Duran a lot. Auntie Anya's kitchen staff sneak her cookies when mum and dad aren't looking, but Uncle Ez's castle is just different. Maybe it's just because she knows it better. There's always a secret passage to find, or a hidden room to discover, and when mum and dad have to travel for a meeting she's not quite old enough to go to yet, she and Bate while the hours away by playing hide and seek with Lesser and Turin, or by exploring the castle grounds with Uncle Soren. Sometimes even Uncle Ez joins in, his grin just as sneaky as hers as they dodge guards in the halls and sneak around in the tunnels with jelly tarts stuffed under their shirts, but she likes disappearing on her own too, happy to hide from her tutors and Uncle Ez's guards with Bate and a couple of books in tow. She's camped out on top of the North Tower tonight. She likes it up here in the spring. It's not so hot that her skin becomes sticky with sweat, but not so cold that she needs more than a blanket over her shoulders to be comfortable. There are never too many guards in Stairway, and even when there are, she just uses moon magic to sneak past them, and the only person who ever finds her up here is Uncle Ez, but she doesn't mind that at all. Bates glow pleasant, just enough to light up her books and her snacks without drowning out the twinkle of the stars above her head. His forever frown makes her giggle, and she rubs his forehead affectionately, savoring the peace and quiet before mum and dad come back from Neolandia tomorrow evening and all three of them are on the move all over again. It's not something she really minds. Sorry, I likes traveling and exploring and seeing the world. Ranan says she's a lot like mum that way, always wandering off or disappearing in search of a new adventure, but sometimes she does wonder what it might be like to just stay in the castle for longer than a couple of weeks. She could explore the tunnels all morning, have lunch every day with Lesser and Turin at their dad's shop, spar with Uncle Soren in the courtyard all afternoon, even have secret sleepovers in the castle library like she's always wanted. That sounds nice, huh, Bate, she says, pillowing her head over his back, book held precariously over her face. Maybe mum and dad will let me stay the whole summer sometime. What do you think? Bate rumbles under the back of her head by way of response. It feels funny, and sorry, I giggles and turns her page. When the trapdoor creaks, she lets out a heavy sigh. There's only one person it can be, and he's probably here because it's well past her bedtime. She pouts at Uncle Ez as he climbs onto the landing, not wholly satisfied with her book yet, lilac eyes wide and begging for just a few more minutes. Please, Uncle Ez. But Uncle Ez only grins and settles against the back of Melong. Hiding away again, are we? He teases. It's very late, you know. What are the guards going to tell your mom? They could not tell her. Somehow I don't think that's going to keep her from finding out that you've been awake past your bedtime. Sorry, I snorts. It's not very ladylike. Some of her tutors might have scolded her for it, but Uncle Ez has never cared and he doesn't now. She snaps her book shut and rolls over onto her tummy. Even if she does, she won't be mad. Ranan always says she was just the same when she was little. You sure about that? Sorry, I pauses because she's is not. She's pretty sure of the opposite, actually. Mum will find out, because she always finds out, and she won't be pleased to hear it. She'll probably be all frowny and disappointed at dinner tomorrow, and Dad said he'll only teach her a new rune if the guards can convince him that she's been good while they've been away. She huffs in the end, hiding her pout behind Bate as Uncle Ez stares her down, his lips tilted in a smirk that knows he's caught her out. Can't you just tell them I've been good, she whines finally. They'll believe you. I could, says Uncle Ez, smirking wider still. But didn't you also skip your lessons today? Dunno that really counts as good. Sorry, I flushes behind Bate, and she presses her face into his side to hide her guilt. Uncle Ez chuckles at her. Tell you what she hears him say. If you go to bed now, and do your lesson tomorrow instead, I'll personally tell your mom and dad that you've been on your best behavior. They'll never find out about all the jelly tarts you ate. You let me eat them. Or the books you borrowed from Opali. I brought them straight back when I was done. Or the prank you pulled on the stable hands. That was Uncle Soren's idea. Uncle S snorts at her. You still did it though, didn't you? You didn't have to scare them with moon magic. He's still smirking at her when she looks at him at last, the blue of his eyes bright with amusement even in the poor light. He grins even wider when Bait rumbles under her chin. And it's past your bedtime too. Thank you, Bait. Bait. Sorry, I sits up with a scowl, her blanket pooling around her waist as she fixes a glare on the grumpy glow toad at her knees. She groans, her argument lost. Please don't make me go to bed yet, Uncle S. I don't want it to be tomorrow yet. We'll have to go again. Uncle S cocks his head at her, his eyebrows knitting together a little in his confusion. Don't you want to visit Auntie Claudia in Lantha? I do, but she sighs, and her voice drops to a mumble. I don't like going away all the time, either. Uncle S lets out a laugh. Just a little one. It sounds almost sad. I get that, he says quietly. There's fondness in his smile, and as much as he likes to tease her, in her head, sorry, I thinks that he likes having her in the castle just as much as she likes being here. There's no one else he can get in and out of so much trouble with except maybe Auntie Anya, but she rarely visits so she hardly counts at all. How about a story, he offers finally. Will you go to bed after that? Sorry, I purses her lips. Maybe, she grumbles. If it's a good story. I think it's a good one, says Uncle S. It's a love story. Your mom and dad's even. Have you heard that properly? Properly? Yeah. Uncle S nods eagerly at her, his fingers scratching absently under Bait's chin. Not the way your dad tells it. He's really bad at telling it. I tell it better because I tell it as, like, an actual story. Does that sound good? I don't know, I haven't heard it yet. Her sass makes him laugh. It reminds her a little of Dad's in the way that it echoes in the still night air, and in the end, he heaves Bait into his lap, shuffles around on the flagstones, and reaches for her blanket so he can toss it over both their legs. Let's see, then he begins. It's not like it was a bad idea. I thought it was a well thought out, completely reasonable, perfectly sound idea, to be honest. Would have solved a lot of my problems, and your dad's problems, and Catullus' problems in one go. What was the idea? Sorry, I asks, her eyes wide and curious. An arrangement, says Uncle S with a smile. A delicate one. The end.